Right. So, what we discussed in the last session about user story part, as far as requirements communication is concerned, as a role of a business analyst. Uh, in traditional practices, when we follow traditional model, we prepare BRD, right? So all that. At the same time, we even prepare about UML diagrams, etc., as we all discussed previously. But when it comes to the agile model, instead of preparing documents, we write user stories, whatever the requirements and functionalities we are about to develop. So for those, we write as a user story. This is all something which comes under the requirements management, right? How you are managing the requirement life cycles, requirement analysis, followed by requirement analysis, design definitions, like how you are going to design the requirements by preparing UML, all that. Last knowledge area, this is what we call it as solution assessment and validation. Solution assessment and validation means finally being a BA, whatever the business solution was identified by us, we have to assess and validate, right? So to what extent the solution was identified was right or not, right? So we have to go back to the previous ones and we need to understand. This is all something comes under solution assessment and validation. Means we need to consider what are the assumptions, constraints, at the same time, the kind of architecture which technical team is supposed to develop, right? So what kind of solution we have identified? Because in our case study, as we are developing a cloud-based point of sale system based on the business problem which customer is facing. So to what extent cloud-based point of sale system is possible, viable, to what extent it can satisfy the needs of the customer, how much time will it be taken, what cloud service provider, which cloud service provider we want to use. So all these things is what something which comes under solution assessment and validation. In the solution assessment and validation, there are few important tasks which need to be performed. The first one about assessing the proposed solution means whatever the solution was proposed by us, that has to be assessed. This is the first thing which normally we do, right? So this is where generally assessing the proposed solution come into picture. Means we need to assess whatever the solution we have identified. What was solution? Our solution was cloud-based POS system. We have to assess the proposed solution which was identified. That is point number one. Point number two, we need to allocate the requirements. Allocation of requirements to the team. What are allocation of requirements? Means whatever the business requirements we have identified, whatever non-functional, functional, security related, regulatory rates related stuff, whatever the requirements were identified. Because in the previous sessions also, when I'm writing user stories, I have shown you what are all the features, what are the functional requirements comes under cloud-based point of sale system, if you remember, right? So by going through that, generally user stories will be written. So those are all nothing but allocation of, those are all nothing but requirements. So based on that requirements and all, if you want to write any functionalities, any business logic to be implemented by the technical team. So allocation of requirements is what something being a business analyst will be doing. Next, we need to assess organizational readiness. Why organizational readiness? Because you are developing an application for the customer requirement. So end of the day, what is that we needed? End of the day, customer has to satisfy. Customer must be ready to receive what solution we are going to give. So that what is required, readiness is needed. Readiness in terms of infrastructure. Means they need to make infrastructure ready. Of course, this is a cloud application so that they don't require any infrastructure. Because whatever the login credentials we have given, if they can log in and they can use it, that's not an issue. But when it comes to on-premise applications, because every application is not a cloud, right? Because of course, it is we are moving towards cloud environment, but we cannot say 100% all the application will be in cloud. In future, some kind of solutions we develop that must be in on-premise also, not cloud all the time, on-premise also. If it is on-premise means whatever the regulated infrastructure is needed. Infrastructure means hardware and software environment, which supports the to install the application, to run the application that is needed. That's what we call it as assessing the organizational readiness stands for. Means that infrastructure has to be created, that infrastructure has to be prepared well. That's where generally organizational readiness come into picture. So this is what generally we have to assess it. Assess organizational readiness is what something which we have to do, which we have to perform, right? So this is where assessing organizational readiness stands for. So they have to create and they have to keep infrastructure ready so that whenever we have delivered application to the client, so that they don't see any difficulty in managing that. That's what this point comes into existence. Next, we need to define the transitional requirements, because this is where it was, as I told you in the beginning, when I explained you about the BRD document, if you remember, I told you transitional requirements means transitioning from existing state to target state. Existing nothing but as is means traditional point of sale system. Target state is nothing but to be proposed one. What was that? Developing cloud-based point of sale system. So transitioning from an existing state to a proposed state to existing state to a target state. This is where we call it as transitional requirements come into picture. So defining the transitional requirements is also one of the tasks which normally we have to be known with. Next, we need to validate the solution. Whatever the solution are we going to develop, that has to be validated. We have to validate the solution to an extent possible. What solution we have given, to what extent it is right and all right. So this is all something which we have to validate. That's where generally validation of solution and all everything come into existence. So once validate the solution and all, the next we need to evaluate solution performance. Means solution was given, okay, solution is decided. But is that solution give us the right performance? Is it something happens in reality? If it happens and all, to what extent? That has to be evaluated. This is where generally evaluating solution performance is what something which we have to be performed with. So these are the different tasks which being a business analyst we have to readdress. Because this is in the proposed solution, right? Allocation of requirements, we have to make sure. At the same time, we have to make sure by assessing the organizational readiness, means they must be ready enough to use the project, right? So that's where generally organizational readiness stands for. Next, you need to define transitional requirements, means from existing state to a target state. This is where generally defining transitional requirements come into picture. Next, we need to validate the solution. What kind of solution are you going to provide it, and to what extent the solution is useful? Why? Because let's say, for example, customer has a business need where they want to expand their retail store services to different places. One of the biggest challenge they could face in future is to manage the infrastructure, whatever the required infrastructure they needed. Managing infrastructure could be the possible challenges which they may face infrastructure wise, right? So it may be expensive also. And even they required a lot of manpower to do all that. So what is that you are doing? Developing a cloud-based point of sale system will reduce that complexity so that they don't maintain any infrastructure as separate. No servers, no firewalls, nothing. Simply they can log into the cloud application, use the application, data management, at the same time managing the data, or else it can be what we call data management, or it can be server maintenances, firewall protections. All these things are not something customer need to manage, because it's a cloud service provider. Whatever the services we have taken, cloud service provider will be taking care of everything, right? So that's not something which we do on our own, right? So that's not something related to us. Cloud service provider will take care of everything. We don't get into that. So that is one advantage we have, right? So validating the solution is what it is. To what extent the solution we have given has to be validated. Next, we need to evaluate the solution performance, right? So to what extent solution will be performed. So to evaluate the performance of the solution, once we are developing a cloud-based point of sale system, we need to, but the challenge here is that we need to hire the right cloud service provider, right? So because if you have not chosen the right cloud service provider to develop the application, then there will be of no value for that. Because, so if, for example, we have chosen one cloud service provider, that service provider is not giving quality services to us on time and quality. So then how best the application we have developed, it doesn't have any value, right? So because the services were not good. So that is one of the thing which we have to evaluate in context to the performance. So choosing the right cloud service provider to develop the application, either it can be Microsoft Azure or AWS, right? These sort of cloud service providers are highly required because they have sufficient infrastructure and all. By conducting our case study into an account, by keeping our case study into consideration, Azure is what generally the cloud service provider we have taken, so which is good. Okay, that's one thing. Next, to evaluate solution performance, let's say, for example, customer wants to use it, they must be having sufficient and well performed internet connection is required. So if the internet connection was not so good, for example, like internet connection was not so good, internet connection is not performing well, then what will happen? Automatically the speed will come down. If the speed is coming down, automatically it impacts on the project level performances. Right. So because even though how well the application, let's say for example, you are connecting to the system, you are connecting to the session, right? So you are attending the session. When your session will be useful to you, when this session will be helpful to you, as long as your internet connection was good. For example, your internet connection was not so good, right? So it's not so speed. There is no speed, nothing as such. So all the time it was disconnecting. What will happen, right? So there won't be any effectiveness. The same way, when we want to use the application in context of the cloud-based point of sale system or something, we have to ensure that whatever the required internet services or something XYZ, and all everything must be quality enough to do that. This is where generally evaluating solution performances and all everything are coming into existence. So these are all something which we call it as solution assessment and validation. We call it as. So we have to assess the solution. It's equally, we need to validate the solution. So this is where generally the final knowledge area, which is called solution assessment and validation, come into picture, right? So this is all about the BA part. Now, in context to solution assessment and validation, as I discussed about epics, user stories, BRDs, SRS, UML diagrams, use cases, etc. It's always important being a business analyst to have a knowledge over STLC. This is where generally software testing lifecycle is all about. Because some profiles they ask you, right? So because do you have a knowledge over software testing lifecycle or not? Because it's not only about gathering requirements, etc. But knowledge over software testing lifecycle is also highly useful. Because software testing lifecycle is this. This is what generally software testing lifecycle is. Means once the project is completed, once we have tested, once we have identified, once the project was taken, right? So once the coding is done, once the requirement of coding was completed, we have to see to what extent quality of work was done by our team. So for that reason, testing plays a vital and important role. This is where software testing life cycle come into picture. Testing life cycle are having these many phases because people whoever wants to pursue their career in the field of testing, it is required for them. But anyway, even for BA also, it's always important for us to know about the stages of software testing life cycle. So the first one is called requirement analysis. So in this requirement analysis, what will happen as far as STLC process is concerned, requirement analysis is a stage where testing people always gather the queries and requirements from the BA team. Usually, testing team has to do that. I'm not saying as a BA because STLC involvement will be majorly on the testing team. Testing team will involve more on this, not by the BA. Right. So BA will be involved maybe in some areas, not in all areas. So first, testing team has to gather the requirements uh, from the BA team, right? So from the business analyst team, from the client, right? So all that testing team has to gather all the requirements. Means what are the requirements we are about to develop? So those requirements. And whenever they have gathered the requirements, they have to see to what extent these requirements we can develop. Okay. So if they have any questions, if they have any queries, all these things will be done in this level, right? So this is the first one. So once it is done, they have to define the testing focus and testing priorities, right? What must be the testing focus and what must be the testing priority? Priority means high level, intermediary, and low level priority. Means what are all the testing things has to be performed uh, yeah. So what are all the performance testing is to happen, right? So this is all something which we have to be seen with. This is where generally defining testing focus, testing priorities, all these are comes into existence. Next, we need to list out testable requirements, right? So what are the testable requirements we have that we have to be tested with? So what are the requirements we have, right? So which requirements to be tested? All these things, that is what something which we have to see. This is where generally testable requirements come into picture. What are all requirements to be tested? Right, so which requirements we have to test, etc. Right, so all these things has to be taken care of here. Next, they need to select about what kind of tool is feasible, because whatever the testing tool are we going to use. So we have to see what tool is something feasible for us to develop this testing, right? So what kind of tool is feasible? Automation tools, because normally in testing there are two: one is manual, second is automation. Manual testing means manual operations, so preparing test cases, test scripts, test plans, etc. All that. But when it comes to the automation testing is concerned, different tools they use like Selenium, Silk, Windrunner, LoadRunner. Right. So different tools they will be using. So that we need to check out the automation tool which is feasible and all, so that we have to be taken into an account. So this is all something, right? So required and all, so that report generations can be prepared subsequently. This is where generally this requirement analysis come into picture. This is the first stage, right? So requirement analysis is the first stage. Second is about test planning stage. In this test planning stage, we need to plan the testing, right? So test planning is what something we have to do. So to do the test planning and all, what kind of strategy document we have to prepare? Because manually there are some documents has to be prepared, right? So because if, for example, if you want to do some work, right? So let's say, for example, you want to develop the project. What is that you do, right? So project planning will be done. So how the requirements were gathered, right? First we have to analyze. Then next we need to plan the designing part, right? How much manpower required, right? All these things we do, right? In the same manner, whenever we want to do some testing, being a testing team, I want to say, right? Because this is not something testing completely not done by the BA, but knowledge towards the life cycle is something essentially required. The reason I'm explaining all this to you, right? So preparing some test plans, whatever, how to do the testing, right? So what kind of test plan strategy document do we require to prepare, right? All these things has to be prepared first. Next, they need to define the objectives and scope of the product or a project, right? What must be the objective, right? Under what objective, under what scope we have defined the project to be developed. So is there any objective behind that? If there is any objective, what was that objective? Right. So if there is any scope was identified, what could be the possible scope? So that part we have to see in context to the project itself is concerned. We need to define objective and scope of the project, etc. All that. Next, we need to list out all the testing types which are involved in software testing lifecycle, right? So what are all the different testing types do we have? Right. So because there are a lot of testing types, unit testing, integration testing, module testing, system testing, performance testing, right? So regression testing, right? The different testings will be there. For example, application was developed. We need to see the performance of the application. That's where generally performance testing comes into picture. Let's say, for example, we need to see whether to what extent server is managing the load. So for that, load balancing will be done. Let's say, for example, we are integrating hardware and software. To what extent these were integrated properly? Integration testing. At the same time, there were some changes we have made in the existing application which was already developed. That is called regression testing. So different testings is what something which normally we do. Right? So testing types I want to say. So they have to list out all the testing types which are involved in testing, all that. Next, they have to select the testing tool. This is where here, right? So first of all, we need to say what kind of tool is feasible. So based on that, we have to select the testing tool. Whatever the testing tool is something suitable and all that we have to select here. This is where generally testing tool selection and all everything were required. So once the testing tool selection is done, the next is that resource planning. How many people required? So resource is not only a manpower, it can be a technology also. Manpower resource or it can be a technical resource. Resource planning and is what something we have to do, right? So how much resources we required. It can be a manpower resource, it can be a technical resource, right? So resource planning is what something we have to do. So once the resource planning, we need to identify the roles and responsibilities. Whatever the roles do we have, whatever the responsibilities do we have. All these things is what something which we have to be done with. Right? This is where resource planning come into picture, right? How many resources do we have? So that sort of understanding is essentially required when we are working on the project. This is where generally this resource planning come into picture, right? So we need to determine the roles and responsibilities. All these things are comes under the resource planning. Next, they need to prepare a test schedule, right? So whatever the testing they want to do, they have to manage the schedule. They have to prepare the schedule, means timelines. How much time will it be taken? How to perform it? So this is all something comes under the test schedule part. So requirement analysis is the first one. Second, they have to do the test planning, right? So whatever the required planning they want to prepare. So this is all something comes under the test planning part. So once we have done with test planning, the next was about test case development. This is where generally test cases will be prepared. These test cases are almost similar like the use cases what we have seen in the development. Because if you remember, whenever there is a development of functionalities were taken place, if you remember, whenever we are discussing about functionalities and all, I have shown you about use cases development, right? So pre-condition, post-condition, right? So what is the success scenario, right? So whatever I have explained you so far. In the same case, in the same way, test cases. Because test cases are for the benefit of the testing team. Because they have to see to what extent these test cases are something useful and all everything is what something which they have to be seen with. This is where generally this test cases and all everything were coming into picture. We need to prepare the test cases. Test case development is what something which we have to be seen, which we have to be identified, right? So this is where generally the preparation of test cases and all everything were coming into existence. So once we have prepared the test case, the next is about test automation and test scripts. Whatever the test automation to be done. So what are the different scripts they want to write? So for that, what kind of data which is required for us to execute these test cases? So this is all something comes under the test case development, which testing team has to be done. Now here is a question you can ask. One thing, Raj, to what extent being a BA are we going to involve in this? This is where generally we will be involving in this. Because whatever the requirements required, for example, if testing team wants to write some test scripts, they want some requirements. Who is going to give the requirements? That requirements will be given by the BA. That is the reason why, in context to the test case development, when in part of preparing the test cases, whatever the required functionalities they'll be mentioning in the document. So those requirements will be given by the BA. That's the reason why BA involvement will be there in this level. Okay, because business analyst will give you the requirements, because that requirements will be developed, that requirements will be written as a code that has to be tested. So initial requirements who has to give, business analyst has to be provided. So this is where we will be involving in it. This is test case developments and all everything is something relating to that sort. So once the test case development, the next is about test environment setup. Test environment setup means we have to create an environment in such a way, whatever the hardware and software we require, right? So all these things are comes under test environment setup. Means once we are analyzing the requirements, right? So we need to list out all the hardware and software. Whatever the required hardware do we have, whatever the required software we have. So we need to set up all that, right? What is hardware, whatever is the software we have. So we need to identify all that required hardware and software to set up the test environment is what something which we have to see. When will it required? So once we have analyzed the requirements, we have to see and ensure that what kind of hardware and software is needed, right? So infrastructure is required for us to do the testing in context to automation testing. All these things are comes under this category in the test environment. Next, we have to prepare the test environment, and they have to perform the smoke testing. Smoke testing means environment was created. To what extent this environment will support? To what extent this environment is something useful? So if you want to know that, smoke testing is required. So smoke testing will evaluate the environment. What is the environment we have and all? Evaluating the environment is what something which smoke testing do. So this is where generally smoke testing will be performed by the testing team. So make sure whatever the infrastructure they have prepared to develop the testing is right or not, right? So for that, generally smoke testing is what something which they do it. So once the smoke testing done, the next we need to accept and reject, right? So whatever the smoke testing results do we have, so that we have to see, right? So accept and reject all that. So this is where generally accepting and resulting and building depending on the smoke testing results. All these things are comes under the test environment setup. And this is where generally this test environment come into picture. Testing environment is what something which normally do here, right? So test case development will be done. So once the test case development was done and all of the thing, test environment setup is what something we have to see. What is the environment do we have? Right. So all these things is what something which they have to be known with, which they have to be clear with. This is where generally test environment setup come into existence, right? So this is where it was come into existence. So once the test environment was created, because unless until if there is no proper environment for the testing to be performed, there will be there is no possibility for you to do any type of testing. So if you want to do testing and all, that environment has to be created properly. That is required. So once it is done, the next is about test execution. We need to execute the test cases. What are the test cases do we have? All the test cases has to be executed. Test execution and all everything is what something they have to do. Right. So this is where generally this test execution into come into picture, right? So execute whatever the test cases was prepared by us, so that we come to know the success rate, right? So this is where generally this execution of test cases and all everything will come into existence. Next, we need to update the status of the test cases, like pass or fail. Let's say, for example, login page was created. In that login page was created, whatever the fields required and all everything were mentioned. So there are two kind of results. One is expected result, second is actual result. What is expected result? Expected result is what something which customer is expecting. Actual result may not be the same. Okay, actual result may vary. So if both are same, let's say for example, expected result and actual result are both are same, then test condition is considered as pass. If both are not same, test condition is considered as fail, right? So that's how generally this status will be mentioned. This is where generally this test executions and all everything are coming into existence. This is where test execution come into picture. Next, at the same time, we need to assign whatever the failed cases and all everything has to be assigned here. Followed by this, we need to track the defects, right? So for example, if there are any defects were identified between expected versus actual result. Expected is what customer is expecting. Actual is what something showing on the screen. Those are the two things. If both are same, next condition result will be pass, so that you don't see any defects in that. But if there are any defects were identified, for example, right, if there are any defects were identified, the defects will be again readdressed by the testing team. That's where, if you remember, when I told you about user stories, writing user stories in the product backlog, if you just recollect yourself, I told you, right? So because there are not only user stories, bugs will also be there. Why bugs? Because whatever the defects were identified are called bugs. So what will happen? Those bugs again will come back and store in the product backlog. So from the product backlog, whatever the bugs were identified, so those whatever the bugs were identified, again that will be addressed by the testing team subsequently. This is where generally test execution come into picture. So test environment setup is required. So once we have created an environment, test execution is also needed, right? So we have to do the test execution also. So test execution is also one of the key and important element which we have to be performed, which we have to be known with. This is where generally test execution come into picture. So we need to execute and see to what extent these test cases do we have, right? So how to update and status the test cases. Next, defects, how to track the defects to closure, right? So all these things are comes under the test execution part. So once the test execution done, the next is a test cycle closure. Test cycle closure means how to close the cycle, right? So how to close the cycle means, for that we have to make sure we need to prepare test closure report. That has to be prepared, right? So if you have not prepared any test cycle closure report, then there will be no value for that. So preparing test cycle closure report is what something which we have to be prepared with. So for that, whatever the possible evaluation in terms of the test cycle completion criteria. What is test cycle completion criteria? Means there are some criteria we have to follow. First thing about test coverage, right? Test coverage means longevity, length, right? So canvas, that's what coverage stands for. Whatever the larger canvas of testing we do, that's where general test coverage means where are all, which are the areas were tested by the testing team, right? Either it can be hardware, it can be software, it can be functional requirements, it can be non-functional requirements, it can be security requirements, it can be of anything, right? So this is all something comes under the test coverage part. Is it an on-premise application? It can be a cloud application. This is all something comes under the test coverage part. This is point number one. So once the test coverage is done, next is about quality. We have to see the quality of testing, because it's not something that you are doing work, right? So that work must have a quality. Quality of work must be delivered by us. That is one of the key element we have to be focused anywhere. Right? Whenever we do the work, it's not simply doing work, right? So the quality of work has to be delivered by us. That is the ultimate motto behind. So if that was not the case, then if that was not there, so then there will be no value for that. This is where generally quality we have to see. To what extent the application we are developing, to what extent the quality do we have. So all these things are comes under the quality part. So test coverage is required. At the same time, we have to see the quality of the testing, what is that we are going to do, etc. All that. Next, we need to see the cost. How much cost will it be taken for us to complete? That's also needed, right? So cost is also needed. How much cost is taken, right? So cost is also one of the prime element we have to be focused on, right? So how much cost will it be taken for us to complete? So this is all something comes under the cost part. So test coverage is required, quality is required. Next, cost is required. At the same time, time. How much time will it be taken for us to complete, etc. So this is where generally test cycle closure is all about. So this is what generally software testing life cycle is. So it's not only about solution assessment and validation. As part of solution assessment and validation, whenever we are evaluating that, whenever we are validating all this, it's always important for us to know about the testing lifecycle process. What is the software testing lifecycle process do we have? So that software testing lifecycle process is also one of the key and important element which we have to be seen. So to do software testing lifecycle, being a testing team, they have to undergo requirement analysis, which is the first thing. I'm just repeating it. Okay. Requirement analysis is what something which they have to be done with first. So once the requirement analysis, the next they have to do the test planning, whatever the planning required for the testing that has to be tested by them. This is where generally test planning come into existence. So followed by this test case development, what are the different test cases they have to prepare? So that they have to be prepared here. This is where test case development come into existence. So once the test case development, the next is test environment setup. Right? So what are the required environment was needed for us to develop the application? The test environment setup is required. So once the test environment setup is done, the next is test execution. Whatever, how to do the testing, right? So what kind of test execution process to be required to follow? All these things are comes under the test execution part. So once the test execution done and all everything, the next is about test cycle closure. So how to do this closure means we have to prepare a closure report in such a way. We have to make sure whatever the test coverage we have, the kind of quality testing was done, right? So the amount of cost which is involved in it, how much time will it be taken for us to complete? So this is all something comes under the test cycle closure part. Test cycle closure is something relating to that stuff. So this is what generally software testing life cycle is all about. Right? Requirement analysis, test planning, test case development, test environment, test execution, test cycle closure. As like as project development life cycle, PDLC, right? As like as SDLC, I mean to say. Because as like as software development life cycle, there will be software testing life cycle also. Software development lifecycle explains you about the development phases, analysis, planning, design, implementation, testing, deployment, delivery, maintenance, right? So these are all comes from a software development lifecycle. But when it comes to the testing lifecycle means what are the different phases are there in testing, right? So these are all the different phases of testing do we have. So being a business analyst, we are the one who is going to give us the requirements to the customer. So hence it's always important for us to prepare these well in advance. This is where generally software testing life cycle in context to the role of a testing people or testing professionals itself is concerned. Having a knowledge over software testing life cycle is important. At the same time, not only this, we need to have a knowledge over the test cases, whatever are we going to prepare. So what kind of test cases are we going to prepare, right? So how, because to develop these test cases and all requirements has to be given by us. This is all something which being a business analyst team, which we have to be performed. Clear everyone? Understood?
Yes.
Clear or not?
Yes.